right, welcome everybody to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined yet again by Eric Hanson of Inland Productivity.
Well, thanks, Chris. I'm not sure what I do to deserve this honor, but thanks for having me.
I'm not even sure it can be considered an honor. It may be one of those things where our lot in life has been defined for us in advance, and it's just fate.
Aha.
So this is actually a first. You will be the first person to have been on not one, not two, but three episodes in a very short period of time. You literally hold the record now for the most episodes, and I think that says
I
something.
apologize. I apologize to the audience in advance then.
I think there's no apology needed. I think this actually is meant to be the conversation, in fact, that we were having the other day as it pertains to uh, CIS Top 20 framework or any framework really is what are we doing for the different vendor product services that we position. And then to sell well, we always say, well, drink your own Kool-Aid, drink your own champagne. We try to avoid saying, eat your own dog food. But you have, before we started, that I need to go and in fact try a milk bone. I don't know that I'll share that on an episode, but hey.
Oh, I think you totally should. I think you should totally just eat a milk. Yeah, I suggest a small one.
A small
one
okay,
for a small
yeah.
dog. Yeah.
That's like if you get your mouth washed out with soap, don't go for the whole bar. Like take as little as you can.
I can fortunately say I never had that experience, but I know some people who did.
Well, maybe if I'm going to eat a milk bone, maybe you should take a bite out of a bar of soap.
Can I choose the soap?
You can choose the soap. I'm looking for chocolate flavored. Yeah.
Yeah. Do I have to finish? I know somebody who sells beer flavored soap. So
I could see that being maybe that's a thing. I don't know that if I was punishing a child and I gave them soap, I don't know that I would lead with beer flavored soap, but hey.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly no beer effect soap.
So one of the things that I have had to do over the years is working in frameworks that are regulated, and you have situations where they say things like, not only will you have vendor X for your firewall, but you also need to provide proof that you have a second vendor to provide sort of the redundancy. And obviously, in my experience, I've always said, well, it'd be nice if I had, say, two FortiGates or two Cisco's or two something, because they have a lot of things that blend together to make that easier. You brought up a point the other day that I thought was really worth talking about, and that is what happens if the product that everybody is using is compromised? What then? And I think this is where I think you need to share, because it really made me think about all of the environments that I've worked in and then trying to play that back. Am I using those products and services internally? And if I'm not, can I defend why I'm not? Which I think is really the point.
Right. So, on this one, I have the perfect one because you're wearing the vendor's shirt. Mail filtering is a good one. I won't say who.
Yeah.
But mail filtering is a good one. The vendors are like, hey, if you come over to our solution and use our solution, you can use it internally for free. Awesome. Sounds good to me. I like the price. Product seems to work okay. I'm going to roll this out to all my customers. That's awesome. So mail is an easy one. If the mail vendor, craps the bed, what do you got to do? Change some MX records, be aware that it happened. Hopefully you have not taken the default TTLs and left the TTLs real high so that your mail continues to bounce. But as a service provider, you go, well, yeah, their thing broke, but I just changed MX records, let stuff deliver directly for a little bit. Once it came back up, I swapped them back. Is that a good use of a freebie? Maybe so that your team is well versed in how that particular product works, because it would be a common inbound call question, maybe at least for your lower level guys.
Well,
But
rewind that for a second, because I don't know that everybody is necessarily following that. You're referring to the in the drink your own Kool-Aid. You've onboarded a vendor in the mail filtering space, and you've chosen, because of this free to internal use. If you roll your clients customers out on this, you get to use it for free.
right.
Explain the concern, because I think you're not proposing that the vendor you're using with your clients is necessarily shouldn't be used with your clients. But the bigger question is, should you also use it too?
Correct. And kind of where I was headed with that was, it's one of those places where I think you can kind of get away with using the same vendor that your clients are using, because it's a super easy fix if it breaks, because now of course all your clients are broken too. But if it breaks, it's a super easy fix for you to undo. So that might be one of the areas where I'm like, okay, maybe I'll use the same mail filtering as the customer, as I'm selling to a customer. But it changes when you talk about other services, I think. Should you be using the same endpoint protection as all of your customers? Should you be using the same phone system as your customers? People are really bumpy when their computers don't work. They are way more bumpy when their phones don't work.
Sure. And even with
And
their fax machine, if their fax machine doesn't work, that's pretty bad too.
right, right, because we now have all these alternate forms of communication, but at the end of the day, we don't want to hand our cell number out to every one of our customers. Certainly, our prospects don't have that, and if we've got inbound calls coming for prospects, you can't. You probably had one opportunity at that customer, and when your phone didn't work, you don't have another opportunity.
So let's use the phone as an example, because I think that there's the world of VoIP, the world of SIP trunking, and the different ways that you can create inbound communications, whether it's a cloud hosted, it's a hybrid, you name it. Is there more to it than that? Like, so for example, if I have a client that is on all hosted, and obviously if that hosted environment goes down, there's not going to be any sort of like it's rolling over to my cell phone. But that doesn't
Right.
mean that you couldn't have redundancy in place that says, in the event that I can't get to that um, SIP trunk, or that there's some sort of failover pre phone solution, that you've got redundancy in place, as opposed to. So I'll give you an example. I work with a school district. We have an Avaya phone system, and it's currently in a state of hybrid mode, in the sense that each one of the locations has some analog POTS lines, and then they all are attached to the same PRI. So if the PRI goes down, we can still talk between buildings, and we can still get phone calls from the outside world into those buildings. But I haven't implemented two different phone systems to make that work from two different vendors.
Right. Right. So I mean, like all of these things we talk about when we talk about redundancy, when you make one thing redundant, in most cases, all you're doing is moving the single point of failure someplace else.
Right.
So in a phone system, all right, I have two trunking providers, whether they're PRI or SIP or POTS lines, however it's getting to this phone system. If you've got an on-prem system, that's cool, but now your single point of failure is the on-prem. It dies, you're done. The network dies, you're done. So okay, I'm going to make it cloud. So I got rid of all of my single points of failure, and I've just moved my single point of failure to a provider. Now, hopefully that provider's got better redundancy in their system, but do they have single points of failure? Is their single point of failure the trunk provider that they're using upstream, because there's only really a handful of them when you get down to it. And I've moved the single point of failure, but did I eliminate it? No.
Well, let's follow that for a minute, because I feel like I want to come back to sort of this unique vendor redundancy, where I have vendor A versus vendor B. Not so much in my environment, two different vendors, but that there's a a difference or a differentiator between the two. So I want to come back to that, but first I want to go down this path of what you're referring to is essentially uh, kicking the can down the road, right? And and I think an example of kicking the can down the road isn't necessarily as potential doom and gloom because we talk about single point of failure. I think about every environment that we've set up over the last decade. Let's just say they only have one internet connection. How
Right.
many cases do we really have that connection coming in and connecting to more than one firewall? Not very many, right? So
Not
you've
very
got
often.
lots of single points of failure, and we just go by the fact that the probability of, say, the firewall failing frequency or percentage wise is a risk we're willing to take. But we probably would spend more energy on having, say, two data circuits from two different vendors because, you know, it's not necessarily the ISP's problem that someone took a bulldozer outside, but those are the risks we're dealing with. And then I think
Yeah.
about the businesses that say, I want to touch it, feel it, see it. You and I can attest to having been there where we went all in, all out, even got so redundant that the room below the server room that is currently a wait room could very easily be turned into part two of the data center for that office building, right? Like,
Right.
and we're in what, a full rack that we had in there, three full racks to fill.
Yep.
So that model has lots of redundancy, but it's still in that one physical space and one choice for power, one choice for a lot of the things that feed that. And I look at the, say telling somebody we want to move you to the cloud, we're going to move you to Azure or AWS or any number of things. And I think about, well, that's still a single point of failure in some respects. I'm pretty
Sure.
sure that the redundancy of power, the redundancy of geolocation, the list just goes on and on and on. That to me feels like, while it might still be single point of failure, it is small potatoes in comparison to what everybody else has in their own office. So
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah. No, it's definitely much. While it's a single point of failure, it's a lower probability of failure.
so I guess I think about that and I go, okay, so what are the things that I should be thinking about? Because I think ultimately this is a good example of it. Is if I say Azure environment or Azure, depending on who you are, I look at, does that mean I should use the Microsoft firewall? Should I use the all included stack that Microsoft can provide me, or do I need to be vendor differentiating even in that environment to have that not single point of failure for everything?
Right. Right. Well, you know, I'll give you my take on that. You know, for Azure or Office 365 or any of those environments, you know, they all uh, offer backup that is on their cloud. But if it really hits the fan, is that backup going to be available to you? Are you going to be able to do anything? And I think that's where it leaves room for other vendors to innovate in that space. And you know, there's lots of vendors now that sell Office 365 backup, for instance,
Sure.
where they're going in snapshotting the data 2, 3, 4 times, you know, whatever the product is a day. Is that you know, well, why wouldn't I just trust Microsoft to do that? Well, if Microsoft can't deliver the data because they had an outage of some sort, you know, and they've been doing not the best job in the last year, you know. Office 359 more maybe is more is a more appropriate term for it right now. But you know, they've had their fits and starts. Last year, if I went and was selling 365 or something like that to somebody, I'd go in and say, look, you know, this thing was pretty unreliable until about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And for the last 3 years, they had a really good run. You know, they had that one big outage down in Texas that, you know, stuff happens.
Right.
I'll give them that. But outside of that, they really didn't have a lot of problems. Last year, it had 2020 written all over it, man. They had all sorts of problems. And, you know, you would think that you get bigger than that. And when you have those sorts of problems with a service like that, it's easy for us as MSPs to go, it's Microsoft. We can toss the problem off.
Right. Kick the can again.
Right. We can kick the can, but and customers will accept that for whatever reason. They will accept. Well, yeah, Microsoft goofed up, and okay, and they'll move on for the most part. I mean, there's still
a brand
people
recognition, I think, that's associated with that. So talking about mail filtering, it's not like our clients are going out and doing searches on mail filters and going, "Ooh, that one sounds really promising. Let's try that one out."
Exactly. That seems like a good solution.
Until it
and
fails.
If they have right, and if they have a tiny, if they have a problem, they have an outage. And I defy you to find me one that hasn't had an outage at one point or another, whether it's, that they get overwhelmed with traffic or whatever it is that happens. They didn't provision enough extra horsepower in AWS.
Right. I mean, everything's finite, even when they say it's not. It's like saying you have unlimited storage in your Exchange mailbox, and you discover that when you hit about 15 to 20 gigs, it doesn't really feel like it's unlimited anymore.
Right. It's unlimited with limitations.
Right. Sounds like my cell phone plan.
Exactly. It's unlimited, but
so we're going down this path that we're really, I think we're following the path, but I'm just curious, where do we go from this single point of failure and having the redundancy that I think is more about redundancy in the peripheral areas and in the communication space for how do we communicate with each other than it is on all of the components within the environment, right? So there's probably 3 or 4 things that one should really consider, either A, not having the same thing as their client, because there's probably that uniqueness that says we stand out differently, or it makes sense to not use the same thing because of if it failed, you still need to be able to be accessed while the client may not have that same level of requirement.
Right. So, I mean, I'll talk about we'll go back to the phone conversation. We got a little off topic there, but on the phone side, we sell a lot of hosted. We sell some prem. What do we use internally? Well, we use prem because I feel like we have some control over that prem environment. We've got 3 internet connections over 2 different mediums coming into 2 different ends of the building from different directions. We thought about all that. The Johnny Backhoe incident.
Right.
It happens. And in some of the areas, I'm in Southern California, we have a lot of aerial cable, and somebody takes out a telephone pole, the aerial cable's gone. So if you're lucky enough to have a situation where the utilities come in a couple of different ways, as long as you got power, I can still make the phones ring. I can still answer the phone. So, that deals with kind of the power and the connectivity piece of it. And worst comes to worst, 4G backup is a thing, and it does work. It's far from perfect, although a lot of vendors would like you to think it's perfect. It's far from perfect, but you can still get a phone call over it. You're probably going to have a significant impediment on the
call quality
data side. Well, yeah, call quality. I mean, if you deal with your quality of service and all that at the router side, you can deal with that, but you still have to have some failover there, and that's if we're talking SIP trunks on that phone switch. So then, okay, should you have more than one SIP trunk provider? Probably so. Because if your phones go out and your customers' phones don't go out, okay, the customer might be bumpy.
That's almost worse.
Right.
I mean, if the customer goes down, their cell phone probably still works and they're calling you to fix it.
And they're calling you. Right.
If your services go down, I don't know about you, but I don't like to give my cell phone out to every client just so they can call my cell phone, because they would call my cell phone all the time.
Correct. Yeah. So, how many of us have a Google Voice number on our cell phone deliberately,
Right.
so you can hand that number out rather than your cell phone?
Again, you just added another layer of discernment, if not redundancy.
Right.
So I still feel like you could be providing the solution that you described to any one of your clients that wants to have that low of a risk profile, right? So talk me through, say, some other areas where maybe it's less about the risk profile from a client perspective and more what is the impact to business, your business specifically, if you have clients go down because of the product or service that they're using that's different from yours.
Right. So, I think, one of the areas that probably bears some more thought is, AV and intrusion detection. Should that be the same? Should you be running the same thing on the server environment that you're running on the workstation environment? Because if it gets missed at the workstation environment and it pushes up to the server environment because the product you happen to select for whatever reason didn't do a good job at the workstation, but these 18 other products or 800 other products, whatever it is, that you might have had deployed on the server would have caught whatever it is.
So that's a really good one that I actually had this conversation the other day with an MSP, and they made a decision for what they're running for EDR on servers that is a much higher profile product as far as what it's capable of doing than what they went with for the EDR on their workstations and end user devices. And the reasoning was almost entirely based on cost. But when I look at the challenges that we face, if I compromise your laptop, but it doesn't get compromised at the server, then my limitation of what was compromised is much smaller, and I'm spending the money where it's most important, which I think goes back to the loop of everything we've talked about so far is be thinking about where you're putting the money into the redundancies, regardless of who the vendors are, because at the end of the day, something's going to break, something is going to have an outage. What are the ones that we can feel good about and control versus the ones that we can't? It's like the prayer, dear Lord, give me the strength to change the things that I cannot accept and the endurance to accept the things that I cannot change.
Right.
So
yeah. Well, it would be nice if in the current environment we had a situation like we did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where you could say, hey, Mr. Customer, yeah, a hard drive in your RAID array died. Oh, yeah. And you didn't even notice. You're welcome.
right.
Most of the stuff that is provisioned today, they notice because
Right.
it's, it's a one-shot deal. And, let's talk about Microsoft Office just because you really have two options. If Office breaks, what happens if the authentication servers break?
Right.
We got that example last year.
Right.
If you were still authenticated, you were okay. If you
Yep.
weren't, you were done. You couldn't open anything. It was over. Go pack up and go home.
Yeah, and if you didn't have geolocation, if you were in one region and not more than one region, we also had that outage too, where the East Coast side was like, if you were on the West Coast provisioning, you were fine, and all your friends didn't have any way to communicate with you because they were on the East Coast.
Yeah, exactly, and the but with services like Microsoft Office specifically, we're sort of stuck,
right?
Unless you want to do a prem deployment and have Exchange on site and all that. Now, most of our customers are Office 365.
Well, I think that kind of comes back to some of the third-party stuff, right? Because I think about some of the vendors whose products are doing some of that filtering, and they sit in front of. So your MX records are routing mail through that first, but they're transparent enough so that if they did go down, mail still gets delivered based on how the DNS records are handling that, delivery.
Right. Or you can, as the MSP, you can go in and change that very quickly.
Sure.
That's quick to change. But the problem, that Microsoft had with the lack of what's the word? What am I looking for here?
This one I'm not sure which one you're.
No, with the inability to authenticate.
Oh, sure. There's not much you can do about that one either.
There's not much you can do about it, but maybe you can. Microsoft does still sell Office volume licenses. You can still buy that, and it doesn't stop working.
Sure.
When it can't call home. Exchange server, an on-prem Exchange server, doesn't stop working when it can't call home. So that's actually one of the reasons that we're the oddball. We still run an Exchange server in-house because the reality is the thing's pretty reliable.
Sure.
It's backed up on a device that we can, if we had to, we could stand it up on that device.
Right. Might be a little slower, but it'll do it.
Right. So we can run it on that vendor's device, and I'm trying to stay super vendor agnostic, other than bashing Microsoft here.
And I think that's fair because Microsoft has done it to themselves, as has Google and AWS, and trying to explain when there's outages, it's obviously not the vendor's fault; it's your fault until you can prove definitively that it was them. So as we get close to wrapping up here, the thing that I want to have our listeners hear is like, what's the one or maybe two areas where you're like, not only am I going to be different vendor, but I'm going to be different type of delivery. And maybe it's not quite that explicit. Maybe it's more of different vendor or different way to deliver, even if it's the same vendor.
Well, yeah, I mean, so we do use the same mail filtering product that our customers use, but there is an alternate path to us through a completely different mail filtering service to a different domain. That doesn't solve the primary domain problem, of course, which you'd have to solve with an MX record, but it allows us more than one way of getting that mail in and out. But telephones.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so on the mail one, you're essentially saying you may not be able to get to me at inland-productivitysolutions.com, but you can get to me at inland-prod.com. There's
right.
And as long as you communicate that, hey, if for whatever reason I have an outage on mail, here's mail option number 2 that still gets to me.
Right.
And I think phones would be similar to that too, right? The phone number may not work anymore, but that's not the only phone number used to reach me. And with virtual phone numbers, that may not be a problem at all because it's calling.
Right. Yeah, it's trying multiple, and it doesn't really cost you very much to stand up if you're if you're using SIP trunks, and even some hosted providers will allow you to bring in a trunk from another provider into their system. So if whoever they've hitched their wagon to, because they've pretty much have hitched their wagon to one provider or another, whether it's bandwidth or flow route or whoever it is,
right?
They're hitched to one of them. They're probably not hitched to multiple, but their phone switch probably for that tenant can be hitched to multiple inbound providers.
Sure.
Yes, it is an alternate number, but at least you can still call your customers. You can go outbound.
And sometimes outbound's all you need.
Right. And I mean, the reality is that for most people that we deal with in a business environment, you have more than one way of getting to, whatever service it is you sell or provide. There's email, there's the phone. Those are probably the two most common ways.
Right.
But, if I can get an email, I can call them back.
Right. So you have redundancy in a differing form of communication.
Right. You change channels. It's a mixed bag, I think, because, like me personally, I'm horrible at don't text me. Just don't. Right. If you want me to do it, don't text me.
Sure.
because I will read the text and then I will forget it and I will move
Yep.
on. Because you decided that an appropriate time to text me was 6 a.m. on Sunday.
Sure.
That was not appropriate to me. I probably will never respond to it.
Right.
You know,
Well, and that's
unless
the
you
nature of
get
text
lucky.
messaging. I mean, well, it's text messaging, right? So like I think one of the things that Apple has done an interesting thing that's and not that Microsoft doesn't have some of this too, but being able to pair your phone with your computer. So like while I'm working, I get that text pops up, that communication unifying model. It's starting to become a pretty big deal with these new players. I think one of them is called Paddle. I've seen a couple others that are out there that basically allow you to bring in your Slack, your Messenger. It's the good old days of Pigeon and Adium, those old school chat protocols. Um, but yeah, it's the different channels make sense. Are there any other areas that you think need to have some discernment? Because I think what you've described are easily defendable to a client to say, hey, we have an on-prem phone system and I'm going to sell you a hosted phone system. Their needs are not going to be the same as your needs, right? So
Right. Yeah, I'm going to sell you this. We have that. Here's why, and here's why that makes sense to you. I think in the security space, it makes a lot of sense for you to be using something different than what you're selling to clients. I'm not saying sell them an inferior product, and
no,
I can think of a few that I wouldn't use on a bet. But that you should probably be using something different internally than you're using externally. And does it make your environment more complicated? Yeah. Does it make your support or your internal stuff more complicated? Yeah. Does it
sure.
just make things more complicated? Yeah. But we're definitely not in an industry where lack of complication is the sole thing we're looking for. And we talked about that with integration.
Right.
Should everything be integrated?
Right. I think so. I was thinking about what you said as we are going through this. I started thinking about firewalls. I think about the recent exploit that Sonic Wall is dealing with. That it sounds like was not the actual SSL VPN, but it was their SMA.
Is their actual client or
Yeah,
something?
it's the secure mobile access. I think, which is a slightly different product, and they're still investigating, so we don't know for sure. But it's like I can think of like that being a reason that maybe my clients have Sonic Wall, but I have FortiGate or something else, which uses completely different technology. So even to know that it's been exploited at a client level, the probability of the same exploit happening on my environment is not very high, if even possible,
Right.
because they're completely different, built on proprietary stacks.
Yeah, they're
So
completely different animals. And to that, just to talk to that real quick, you probably should have, if you have more than one path to the internet, you should probably have more than one path that you have to pass through to get to the internet.
right,
We don't have just one router, and everything's on this one box. And we've got 3 different vendors' products in here connected
sure.
redundantly to both paths that can come in. So I mean, it's complicated.
Well, I think along
Um,
those lines, and complicated doesn't necessarily mean expensive, right? So I was thinking about
right.
over the last 5 years where I've seen when I had my MSP and the other MSPs I've worked for, where I started to see us spending more money, it was on or more investment. I wouldn't say necessarily more money; it was a little bit more, but like putting multiple switches before the firewall. So I had redundant switches, redundant firewalls that are all tied to my redundant data circuits. Because if I just have redundant firewalls, I'm still stuck if one of them goes down.
Right. Right. Yeah. Or if the switch ahead of the circuit, that's between the
Right.
circuit and those firewalls goes down. Yeah.
I think it's very common in data center environments where you have your own rack, right? Like you go in there, you put your stuff in there, and no one really thinks about the fact that unless you're having multiple feeds coming into your rack, anything in your rack fails, and you basically are just out
Done.
until you go to the data center. Yeah.
Right.
Well, listen, this has been a great episode, a good conversation around how to discern or differentiate, maybe not necessarily having to eat out of somebody else's bowl or eat your own dog food. Another episode, perhaps. I want to say thanks, Eric, for being on the show this week. And for everybody out there, Have a great week.
All right. Thanks, Chris.